In this chapter, we'll be taking a look at fluid and electrolyte balance as well as acid-base balance. So we will be taking a look here at fluid and electrolyte homeostasis, which is mostly the water balance, and then sodium balance, extracellular fluid volume regulation, the potassium balance, behavioral mechanisms, and salt and water balance, and an integrated control of volume osmolarity as well as acid-base balance. So here, this is a review of your fluid and electrolyte homeostasis. You're supposed to know by now that the sodium and water is mostly in the extracellular fluid volume and regulates the osmolarity there. Potassium is mostly in the inside of the cell, so it's intracellular fluid and electrolytes, and it's very important. Potassium homeostasis is very important for muscle function in general, skeletal, cardiac, both. Calcium homeostasis is very important for a whole host of functions, for example, exocytosis, muscle contraction, and many other functions. And then hydrogen ion and bicarbonate balance, that plays a role with your pH balance. The body must maintain mass balance. That means, in other words, input has to be equal to output. So whatever you drink and or the fluids that you go in, that's the most you can get rid of. So you have to balance what the kidneys get rid of, your fecal material, sweating, the lungs exhaling water vapor. So all of that has to be balanced so that you end up with an input equal output kind of balance. Here's a flowchart that shows you your body's response to decreased blood pressure and volume. So as your blood volume is decreasing, your blood pressure is decreasing, and that is a big concern for your body. You have two very powerful systems to counteract a loss of blood pressure or blood volume, and that will be ADH and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So here in general terms, the volume receptors in the atria and the carotid and aortic baroreceptors, they will measure that loss in pressure and volume. And then your cardiovascular system will respond. Behavioral systems will set in, mediated through your hypothalamus, and the kidneys will also respond by conserving water and preventing any kind of volume loss, any further volume loss. They're mostly relying on these two mechanisms. And behavior modification, you're seeking out water because you're very thirsty, you feel very thirsty, to increase your extracellular fluid volume and increase blood pressure. And then the cardiovascular system is trying to vasoconstrict, which is also part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So there's a variety of mechanisms that set in. Keep in mind that a loss in blood volume or loss in blood pressure is life-threatening, and so your body is very concerned about that. Has very powerful mechanisms to counteract it because a loss in pressure is life-threatening immediately, versus the response to elevated blood pressure and increased blood volume that increases blood pressure, that doesn't kill you right away. This is a silent killer. This is wear and tear on your heart and your cardiovascular system and your body in general, but it doesn't kill you right now. So your body is not that concerned about it, and it doesn't really have powerful mechanisms to counteract increased blood pressure. So your cardiovascular system will kick in with the atrial natriuretic peptide, the ANP. And you're trying to decrease your cardiac output a little bit. You're trying to vasodilate a little bit. Your kidneys, they will do what the atrial natriuretic peptide will tell it and try to excrete salt and thereby water by osmosis. If we're trying to reduce the volume in general and thereby reduce the blood pressure. But keep in mind again, your mechanisms to reduce blood pressure are not very powerful, and they're nothing compared to the mechanisms that you have available to increase your blood pressure in case of a loss of pressure. Water balance in your body follows strictly the principle of input equal output. So if you are subtracting your output from the input, it's supposed to be zero. And, the various points of entry, water gain, would be via eating and drinking, and then also from your metabolism, where your aerobic respiration generates metabolic water, but it's not that much. And most of the water gain is supposed to be coming from what you're eating and drinking, mostly what you're drinking, of course. Water loss is through the skin, the lungs, urine, and then fecal material, with the urine water loss being the big item here. So here, this is kind of a silly picture that shows you the same thing as the previous slide. It just means that you have these input areas, so volume gain areas, and then you have water output areas. I like this picture much better because it's more physiological, and it really shows everything that you need to know about balance, water balance. And it's supposed to be input equal output. That means input minus output is supposed to be 0. Here's some more information about water balance. So in general, the kidneys cannot replenish lost water. All they can do is conserve it. And they do have some powerful mechanisms to reabsorb water and conserve water. A term that you absolutely need to know is called diuresis. That is the removal of excess water in the urine. Diuretics is an important class of drugs that is prescribed for people that have high blood pressure and for other situations as well. But a diuretic is a drug that promotes urine excretion. So that means you are increasing loss of volume and loss of water via urine. Another term that you should know is probably the nocturnal enuresis, that is bedwetting, which is sometimes seen in children. Here's a summary that shows you the osmolarity of the fluid in the renal tubules. As the fluid moves through the proximal convoluted tubule, we are at 300 milliosmoles. Then we're going to the loop of Henle, descending limb, and ascending limb of Henle's loop. We're ending up here losing a lot of water, which increases the concentration to 1200, maybe even 1400 milliosmoles. On the ascending limb of Henle's loop, we're going to remove a lot of salt, which reduces the osmolarity down to back to 100 milliosmoles, which is very dilute. Then in the distal convoluted tubule, we're just going to lose more water, make the urine more concentrated, and it really depends on the permeability to water and solutes that's regulated by hormones. And the main two hormones that act right here at the collecting duct, they are the aldosterone and ADH, where ADH inserts water channels right here that reabsorb water out of the collecting duct, and aldosterone reabsorbs salt, and then the water follows by osmosis. So depending on the hormone status, you get various reabsorption rates right here, and you will concentrate the urine to anywhere between 50 to 1200 milliosmoles. So 1200 being very highly concentrated urine, and 50 milliosmoles is near water, depending on what your body needs and how much fluid you have available for excretion. In the presence of vasopressin, otherwise known as ADH, and I would rather you remember ADH because that abbreviation tells you what the name of the hormone is, antidiuretic hormone. In the presence of this hormone, you will insert more water channels into the collecting duct, and then water is leaving by the masses out of the collecting duct, returning back into the cardiovascular system, and the urine output that you have is minimal, and it will be highly concentrated urine at somewhere around 1200 milliosmoles. So in the presence of antidiuretic hormone, you are reabsorbing maximum amounts of fluid, and that will lead to a highly concentrated urine. So you're conserving water, and that's primarily due to that you have a very high osmotic value in your blood, and you need to conserve water. You need to return water to the cardiovascular system. Also, what happens sometimes is that you may have lost some excessive amounts of fluid via sweating, and now you need to conserve fluids. And ADH is the hormone that's released from the posterior pituitary, and it will insert water channels into the collecting ducts and reabsorb pretty much every drop of water that comes by here until you reach a maximum of concentration in urine, and it's a minimum amount of fluid that you need to get rid of. So here, in the absence of vasopressin, the collecting duct is impermeable to water, so now you don't reabsorb water, the water stays right in here, and the urine that you're excreting is very dilute, only 100 milliosmoles. That's near water, and so you're excreting copious amounts of urine, and it's highly dilute. And one side note here, alcohol, as in drinking alcohol, inhibits ADH. That means you are reducing whatever ADH has been released maybe, and so therefore you are excreting a lot of fluids. That means you will be getting dehydrated, and that can lead to what's called a hangover. So if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, it's highly advisable to always drink also a lot of fluids, a lot of water with it, so that you don't end up with this hangover and this massive headache that comes from a dehydration. And again, alcohol inhibits ADH, the hormone ADH, and so therefore leads to this dehydration. Here are the molecular mechanisms of how vasopressin / ADH, how that works. So once the vasopressin ADH is released from the posterior pituitary, it's being released and it's binding to membrane receptors in the collecting duct of your kidneys. And the step 2 would be that the receptor activates a cyclic AMP second messenger system. Ultimately, it leads to the insertion of water channels, these aquaporins, into the collecting duct, and then once the aquaporins have been inserted here into the collecting duct, massive amounts of water will be reabsorbed and returned into your cardiovascular system. And here you have the profile sheet of antidiuretic hormone, so that's vasopressin / antidiuretic hormone, ADH. I prefer ADH. The two terms are used interchangeably though. So ADH is made in the hypothalamus. It is then stored in the posterior pituitary and will be released in response to high osmotic values in your blood and dehydration. So this is it. It's a peptide hormone, and it has 9 amino acids, and it will be released in response to being dehydrated and having a high osmotic value in the blood. So you need to conserve water, and the steps, we just talked about that. Once the hypothalamus releases the ADH, it will be causing the collecting ducts in the kidney tubules to insert water channels, and that reabsorbs massive amounts of water. So the antidiuretic hormone is made in the hypothalamus, and then the extension here of the hypothalamus is the posterior pituitary, where it is being stored, and it will be released if you have high blood osmolarity and you're dehydrated. So here, more profile on the vasopressin / ADH. Again, I prefer ADH, antidiuretic hormone, the origin and chemical nature, so you can take a look at that. The half-life is relatively short, 15 minutes, and you can just read through the rest of this profile here. There's a flow chart that shows your body's response to increased salt concentration. Let's say you had a high salt meal, one of those ramen noodle soups. They taste good, but there's a lot of salt in them, or any other high salt meal. So you have increased salt concentration that changes your blood osmolarity. And now you're going to release ADH. You also have this feeling of being thirsty, which causes you to hopefully seek out some water, and you get increased water intake. Also, your kidneys respond with inserting water channels, and you have increased water reabsorption. So the kidneys will conserve water, and you will hopefully drink some water, and that eventually will turn your osmolarity back to normal. One more thing to mention here is that high salt concentrations also tend to not just increase your volume overall, but they also increase your blood pressure. And that's why the recommendation a lot of times is that when people already have high blood pressure, you should be reducing your sodium intake so that you reduce the volume retention, and that should help with the blood pressure. So high salt retains water, and that increases blood pressure because you have increased volume, is something to keep in mind.